Virginia Lee Burton's classic children's book, The Little House, won the Caldecott Prize in 1942 and has remained a staple of children's libraries ever since. Even if you don't quite remember it, I'm willing to bet that you'd recognize the cover the second you saw it. It has this beautiful folk art style painting, and it tells the story of a happy little house in the country who watches as the city slowly grows around her. Welcome to The Best Book Ever, the podcast where we get to know interesting people by asking them about their favorite book. I'm your host, Julie Strauss, and joining me today is Dawn Raffel, a writer who has influenced my work tremendously. Now, I tell all of my guests that they're welcome to choose a book from any point in their life, including their childhood. But Dawn's the first person who took me up on that offer and chose her favorite childhood book, instead of choosing her favorite adult book, which is War and Peace. Which, honestly, I don't know what I would do if a guest chose War and Peace. I guess I would either dive on in or quit podcasting altogether. I'm not really sure. But anyway, it was so fascinating to talk about how a book can imprint on us when we're really young and then go on to influence not only how and what we read as adults, but even our own individual creative work. Hi, Dawn. Welcome to the Best Book Ever podcast.
Thank you.
It's lovely to be talking to you, and especially because you did not actually choose your first favorite book out of respect for me. You told me when we initially talked about this that your first book was War and Peace, but you opted not to force me to read that. I have never read it. I managed to get through college without reading it, but I would like to. And we're not going to discuss it in too much detail today, but I would like you to tell me, should I read it?
You should read it. And you can. Years ago, I was working at the Oprah Magazine, and I actually wrote a little short piece on how to read War and Peace, how to make it easy on yourself. Oh. It's out there online somewhere. But, it's interesting. War and Peace is a very long book in very short chapters. And so it really does zip along. People get hung up on the names because there are a lot of variations of names and nicknames. So my rule is just, if you're wondering if this is the same person, yes, it is. And then you can comfortably move along. But for me, I first read this book when I was 13 years old, and I picked it up in a school library. Thank goodness they had it in the library. I had no idea what it was. I had no idea the author was a famous person who I should have heard of. I only picked it because it was the biggest book. And so I wanted to read. I read as an escape. I read to learn about other places, and it was the biggest book there. And Natasha, the heroine, is actually 13 years old when the book starts. So here's this 13-year-old Russian girl who is dreaming of going to dress balls and being courted by her suitors. It was fantastic. So parts of it, of course, flew right over my head. But I've returned to it again many times, and it's just, I just love it. It's immersive. I know it sounds really very highfalutin to say that's your favorite book, but it is.
So it stands up for you as you read it. You read it for pleasure. You don't just read it for research or for assignments or things like that. You have read it on your own recreational time in your life, and you feel like it stands up.
Oh, yes. Many times it stands out more each time you read it. I even had this project of trying to learn Russian so that I could read it in the original, which I really failed at miserably. I could, like about far enough to maybe read a short story by Tolstoy before I gave up. And I really barely remember Russian at all. But it really did spark a lifelong interest in Russian literature as well.
I'm trying to think, are there adaptations of this? Are there movies or TV? There must be.
A movie. Yeah, there is a movie. But this is, read it when you get a chance.
Oh, sure.
If we ever have another pandemic, I had never read Moby Dick. that was my book that I had never read. And I did read it during the pandemic. I was so proud of myself. I accomplished something during the lockdown, and that was I read Moby Dick.
And were you happy you read it at the
I
end?
was. I was. In a way, at the end of it, I thought, why was I so scared of this? But I first encountered that it was on a college syllabus. And as soon as I got the syllabus and the professor on the syllabus, there was a paper on Moby Dick due the Monday after Thanksgiving. And I thought, okay, I know myself. I'm a terrible procrastinator. Is it going to destroy Thanksgiving? And also, what kind of a jerk assigns a paper due on Moby Dick the Monday after Thanksgiving?
That's exactly what I was thinking. And you did it, though.
I did it, yes.
What is your take on finishing books that you dislike?
I don't anymore. I used to make myself read everything through to the end, but I just, there's too many books and too little time. Unless I have a really compelling reason to believe that there will be a payoff at the end that will make it worth my while, I don't finish if I'm not engaged.
That is my philosophy too. And the one that I get hung up on is Moby Dick, which I have now tried 4 times in my life, twice assigned for school. And I managed to not. In my day, it was Cliff's Notes. My kids now use Spark Notes or whatever I don't even know what they used. But twice as an adult, I have tried in different decades of my life. And both times I think I'm not enjoying it enough. But I also feel like Moby Dick is one that I should have read as a student of American literature. And then I think, I don't feel like it. And then I don't read it.
Well, Middlemarch is mine that I've never finished. I just, and I've had so many people say, oh, Middlemarch. And I start and then I'll just stop.
And that's the thing, is there are so many that we can look to as examples of great American literature that I never really feel that bad. I feel a little bit bad, but I also think I know the basic story.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you not choosing War and Peace for this, although maybe that will be the way that I do finally get through War and Peace and Moby Dick, is that someone will say, that's the only one I want to talk about. And I'll say, well, here's my chance now. So maybe I'll have you back on to talk War and Peace.
Okay.
So you were a kid who was willing to pick up books like War and Peace. You must have just really been an avid reader.
I was an avid reader. And my mother would say, like, I used to sleep with a book instead of a stuffed animal. But also you can't do this anymore, but she would go on Saturday, she would go to the grocery store and she would go to get her hair done. And while she was doing this, she would just drop me at the library and she would pick me up when she was done, which she would get arrested for now. Mm-hmm. But so I was there in this library full of books and I loved it.
How did that translate into your adult life? What kind of reader did you become as an adult?
Well, I like a wide array of books, although I tend to gravitate toward literary fiction and memoir and narrative nonfiction. So I really never familiarized myself that much with genre, although I know there are a lot of wonderful books being written there as well.
Did you always know that you would go into reading and writing as a life, as a career? Because you really have made books your entire career.
Yeah, I always wanted to do it. I felt intimidated by it. I was an editor professionally first before I was a writer, before I started to understand, okay, writers are actually, they're just people who work at it. And there is magic in it, but the magic comes out of doing the work.
Oh, I like that. I say this a lot, that the greatest disservice that's done to writers is the way writers are portrayed in movies, which is always the example I think of all the time is the one in Moulin Rouge, where he goes through all of his experiences. And then at the end of the movie, he sits down and kind of has one whiskey soaked night at a typewriter. And then 2 days later, he's got a beard and he's got a full manuscript. And I like that I like that you pointed out that the magic is the actual work. I think that is the thing that is grossly misunderstood about the whole process, is there is so much refining to
It's
it.
work. And of course, that was a he in your example, too. So that stereotype of the writer's life is also usually not a woman's life either. And so,
That's a
we're
great point.
working, and we may be also raising children and doing a lot of other things. So it's not, but yeah, I used to think, well, writers are people who they have that magical lightning strike that happens for them. And it's not that way.
Tell me about this book that you chose to discuss with me today, The Little House by Virginia Lee Burton. I tell everyone who comes on the show that they're welcome to choose a children's book that meant a lot to them. You're the first one who's actually chosen a children's book. Let's start with, do you remember the first time you came across this book?
No, not exactly. I just remember loving this book, so I don't remember the story around it, but I'm going to guess that it was read to me first by a parent before I read it to myself. And I have been thinking a lot about, when people love to ask writers about the books that influenced them, and really we're influenced by so many things. And most people don't really talk about children's books influencing us. And yet those books that we read or had read to us really early on often had a profound impact. It kind of went deep into our psyche, more than books that we just casually read later. And so when I was looking, and I've read it again, and it's a book I've also read to my own children. And it just, when I look at it, it's so beautifully done. And it's also, for a writer, it's kind of a masterclass in writing as well.
Can you tell our listeners the basics of what this book is about?
Yeah, so it was first published in 1942, and it has this concern with urban blight, which, to portray it, it's the little house that is out in the country, and the house is anthropomorphized and enjoys all the turning of the seasons. And then urban blight creeps in until this little house is finally surrounded only by tenements and L trains and subways and grime, and is neglected and abandoned and in disrepair. And ultimately, I think great-granddaughter or even great-great-granddaughter of the person who built the house sees it and recognizes its value, and the house is actually moved back to the countryside and again observes the seasons. So it's a very circular and cyclical book in terms of the changing of the seasons and the generations. And it's a book that it addresses environmental concerns, but in a way that ends with a note of feeling like we do have some agency.
When you first suggested this book, I didn't think I knew it. But as soon as I went to the library and got it, and I had a sort of sense memory of, I'm sure it was part of my childhood, even though I didn't recall it when you first said it. And I think you're right. I assume because of the repetition that we are read books as children, but they imprint on us. Mm-hmm. Because I knew every single picture, and I was so surprised at how I recognized the way the words and the picture sort of mirror each other, and they're sort of curved at the beginning, and then in the middle they get very square. And I was thinking, gosh, it is an amazing thing how these childhood books, they don't ever really disappear from the grooves in our brains, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I think it is, you're talking about the repetitions, like fairy tales have repetitions and children's books have repetitions, and it is how we remember things. For a minute, I was in journalism school, and in the unit that was broadcast, as much as I know, was, they used to say, like, you you tell the listener what you're going to say, and then you say it, and then you tell them what you just said. It's that same thing. We absorb things by repetition.
Now, you mentioned in our emails that, and I'm going to quote you here, you suspect the way the type is laid out on the page affects your relationship to white space on a page. Can you tell me what you meant by that?
Yeah, this book is beautifully laid out, and well, this is audio, but it's the way that type is designed on the page and the way there is white space. And I've always been aware of the way the type looks on a page when I'm reading adds to my enjoyment of the book. It's harder for me, and I think a lot of people, to just read pages and pages of gray. And as a writer, I look at that too. I look for where the space is, and I tend to write with a lot of space breaks, but I like that look of having some air on the page.
Air on the page. I like that. And so will you sort of shy away from books if it looks too dense, if it looks airless? You'll think maybe this is not for me?
Well, I wouldn't rule it out, but to me, it's more inviting if it doesn't look, if it looks like there's some air and some space there. It just is easier to enter. It's also interesting to me. I was thinking about the fact that when I was growing up, really only children's books could have images. And then when you were a grown up, you couldn't have any images in your book anymore. And of course, now that has all changed. And, many adult books do have images, which I think is wonderful.
One thing that I noticed, as I said, I got this at the library, and what I did was I ordered from my library the digital version of The Little House. And then I also went and I looked at the page version. And I hate to sound old and grumpy, but I am a little bit old and grumpy with this because I was able to compare the two experiences, and reading it digitally did not have the effect that the page had with the way that you could look at how the type was part of the overall story. Because the way it was laid out digitally it was sort of a picture of the page of the book, and then the type was reprinted down below. And I kept thinking, gosh, Julie, don't be the get off my lawn lady. But also, this is not a good reading experience.
Imprint. A tactile experience, and it's an experience of sitting with a parent or an adult and sharing the physical book and turning the pages together and looking at the pictures. And I think that's a lot of also, it's an emotional experience.
I would like to ask you about your newest book, Boundless as the Sky. The tagline says, a book of the invisible histories that repose beneath the cities we inhabit. I can't help but notice a through line from that line to The Little House. Has The Little House been on your mind as you went through the writing and publishing of Boundless as the Sky?
That's funny. And it hasn't. And I really didn't start to think about that until you mentioned it. So maybe it's all in there. Boundless as the Sky is in part a response to Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, which is a very extraordinary book of, there are these fantastical cities which ultimately might all be understood as versions of Venice in his writing. And in mine, it was a different response to that, but there are real and dystopian cities that appear and disappear over time. But I suppose in some way I've always been really enchanted by this whole idea of the cityscape and the city. So it could be a little bit in there. I won't dispute it.
I mean, The Little House is a rejection of the cityscape, though, that it's poisonous to humans.
It is, and yet...
Or it's poisonous to the house. I
enjoyed some of the city part of that book too, but I do get that it is a rejection of the city. And this book is not a rejection of the city. I would say it's it's sort of grappling with, well, what is a city anyway? In a sense, it's a fictional construct. We decide it's a city because we create boundaries and we give it a name. And over time, the name may change and the city limits may change and it can be rebuilt and destroyed. And it's really just kind of a fiction that we create amongst ourselves, these cities. And at the same time, they carry a deep history that we might not always be able to see, and yet it's somehow still present.
Why did you choose to structure it the way you did? Because it's two distinct parts.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about that choice?
It's almost like flip sides of the same coin. So the first part really refutes chronological order. It's a series of vignettes or very short stories that take place in these different cities, some of which are real and some of which are imagined. And the second part is very strictly chronological. It takes place in a single city on a single day, which was Chicago 15th, 1933, at the Century of Progress World's Fair, where something happened that day. And it's deliberately absolutely hyper precise about chronology as well. So it's in the reporting of this actual historical event, the Chicago Tribune kept repeating that, all times are Chicago times. And sometimes they would say all times are Chicago times daylight savings time. And so I would go through, but it's what time it is down to the second on Chicago time, where you start to realize, that's also a construct. What time did we decide it is in Chicago instead of what time it is in New York? And is it daylight savings time or not daylight savings? We're still arguing about daylight savings time.
Your interests in what you write, they are so wide ranging. Do you plan ahead? Do you know what's going to grab you next, or do you just is there some whimsy to it? Or
it usually is a really slow brew. It's like I'll be thinking about something for years before I actually really start sit down and write about it. But this Chicago World's Fair really, I became obsessed with this idea that there's this World's Fair in Chicago in 1933. So it's a horrible year. It's the bottom of the Depression. It's the year Hitler came to power. It's a truly horrible year. And yet Chicago has this World's Fair called the Century of Progress. And it's all about how technology will solve our problems. It's like a great Valentine to this beautiful future that we, from our perspective, realized that was not going to come to fruition. What was going to happen next was World War II. And there were already signs of that, clear signs of that were simmering. And so I originally thought that I was working on that piece when I stumbled across the story of Dr. Couney and went down that rabbit hole for 4 years. So that was a different book, The Strange Case of Dr. Couney, which was a nonfiction book, which also in part took place at that Chicago World's Fair. And when I finished that book, I thought, okay, maybe I have gotten this Chicago World's Fair out of my system, but I had not. And so I ended up also going back to the fictional version of it, but it was based on a lot of archival research.
Do you have an idea of where you want to go next in your writing?
I do. It is so currently ill-formed. I actually had what I thought really was an idea, and then it kind of blew up in my face. That's what I mean when I say that these things take a really long time. So I'm not exactly sure enough to even commit to saying it. So there is something I've been thinking about for a while. I'm in the discovery phase. It is again in the historical realm, and I have a particular interest in historical spectacle.
What does that mean?
Well, so like the Dr. Couney book was about the infant incubator sideshows on the boardwalk, and the fact that was something that was a spectacle. That was something people came to look at with fascination. And in Boundless, as the sky in the second half, what happens that day at the World's Fair is the arrival of these 24 seaplanes that were flown over by Mussolini's wingman. It was billed as the Roaring Armada of Goodwill. And again, you have hundreds of thousands of people watching this. And it really was cool looking. It was spectacular in its time. But it's a sort of like, what are the implications of what was grabbing our attention and why, and what weren't we looking at that was going on at the same time?
And how strange to look at it from this point in history.
Well, and for me, it's personal because I know that both of my parents would have been at that World's Fair. They're both gone. So, of course, I developed an interest in it after it was too late to ask. But I even found that my aunt still had some souvenirs from that fair. My dad and my uncle were, when you look at pictures of that World's Fair and you see the little boys who are so happily enjoying this century of progress, and that, those little boys are going to be drafted. They're going to fight in World War II, and not all of them are going to survive it. So for me, that was part of it, was just chilling to consider that.
Can you tell us what you're reading right now? What's on your nightstand right now?
Okay, so what is staring at me on my nightstand somewhat rebukingly is Grendel by John Gardner, which my husband gave me because it relates to something that I am trying to do. But that's a telling of it's the Beowulf monster from the point of view of the monster. And it's another classic book, which I confess to not having read yet. And so that is calling to me right now.
Rebukingly, I like that.
Yes.
My friends and I used to have this joke in college that every English major, when they got their first pet after college, it was always named Grendel. Every single one of us had a dog named Grendel.
All right. I have a dog named Pierre. That's the only dog I have.
That's the only one.
Honestly, there is a Pierre in War and Peace, who's one of the main characters, but Pierre does not have anything to do with War and Peace. He was given the name at the animal shelter, and I just kept it.
Will you share with our guests where they can find you online?
Yes. Well, first of all, if you Google my name, there is just nowhere to hide. It's Dawn Raffel. And so my website is dawnraffel.com. And again, I'm on Twitter and Instagram just under my name. But I have a very good name for the age of Google.
That's true. Well, I'm really, really enjoying Boundless as a Sky. I tried to finish it before we spoke, but I am really thrilled to be reading it. And I'm thrilled to be talking to you. And I hope you'll come back sometime. Maybe we will talk about War and Peace one day.
Sounds great. Okay.
Or something shorter.
Yeah. We could talk about invisible cities.
Right. That's a good idea. So Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been delightful talking to you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Bookworms, I'm eager to hear about the books that imprinted on you as a child. And I'm also eager to hear about the book that is your great challenge. Is it War and Peace or Middlemarch or something similar? I would really love to hear. Let me know over on Instagram at Best Book Ever Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to my brand new weekly pod newsletter at bestbookeverpodcast.substack.com. Thank you for joining me today. And as always, I will see you at the library.